SEP Fanfic Readings presents Osculum Annuum by My Delphi. Chapter 4, 6th Year, Part 1. Hermione spent the first weeks of her summer holidays on the edge of her seat. There were sleepless nights, bitten fingernails, and she had once again fallen into the habit of chewing on her bottom lip. By week 3, the owl finally arrived, and she spent half an hour fussing over the piece of parchment, unable to open it, until finally her mother did it for her. She had passed her OWLs, all 10 of them, all with an outstanding, the best results in 50 years. She could take all the advanced Newt classes that she had planned on taking, and if she stuck to her strict study schedule, she would be able to graduate in 2 years with some of the highest marks in Hogwarts history. And there was nothing short of the end of the world that would prevent her from sitting her Newts and excelling them. And on top of that, she would be perfect. The tight coil of anxiety that had taken up permanent residency in her stomach dissipated, and that night, for the first time in a long time, she fell asleep the moment her head touched the pillow. She no longer dreamed about failing her classes and not being allowed to take the advanced arithmancy class she was so looking forward to. However, that didn't mean that her dreams weren't any less worrying. Instead of her professors shaking their heads pitifully at her, disappointment in their eyes, she dreamed about slow, languid kisses and long, pale fingers caressing her cheek, cupping her jaw, and brushing down her neck. Of hands spanning her waist, dancing over her ribs and cupping her chest. Of a lean, toned body underneath her, and a hoarse, raspy voice. To Hermione's dismay, Draco Malfoy was a persistent figure in her dreams and thoughts, refusing to leave her mind. Her attempts to push him away by recalling the slurs he had called her during their first 3 years at Hogwarts didn't work. Every time she forced herself to think about him sneering the word mudblood at her, the memory was replaced by one of him kissing her after the second task, or handing her the small pot of salve to treat her marks of the blood quill. Hermione knew enough about the term toxic relationship to know that whatever she had with Malfoy, and it certainly wasn't a relationship, wasn't healthy, for either of them. That didn't stop her treacherous heart from fluttering in her chest as the summer holidays came to an end, and she had to pack her trunk to travel to the Burrow before returning to Hogwarts. She ascribed it to being excited to use her magic again, and because she looked forward to seeing her friends, but that was only partially the truth. And yet, Hermione was able to forget about a certain Slytherin for all of half an hour, while she was ushered from one hug into another, following her arrival at the Weasley home. Molly treated her as if she were a long-lost daughter. Arthur was delighted by the floppy disk she had brought him, and if it hadn't been for Molly bustling him away, he would have holed her with questions about Muggle technology for hours. Fred and George tugged on her curls and told her she would need to come and visit their shop. Ginny had grown half an inch, and suddenly made the jump from knobbly-kneed girl to a young woman. And Ron blushed profoundly when he saw her, his eyes lingering on the neckline of her Muggle summer dress. His hug was slightly awkward as he seemed a tad helpless as to where to put his hands, before awkwardly settling them on her waist. At that point, Malfoy was right back at the forefront of her mind, because Hermione could vividly remember how his hands had felt on her waist while they had hidden away in one of the compartments. And it was only the beginning. Over dinner, after Harry had joined them and Molly insisted that he and Hermione absolutely needed seconds and thirds, because they were far too thin in the Weasley matriarch's opinion, Arthur spoke about Lucius Malfoy's trial and his conviction, brandishing a copy of the Daily Prophet. And right there on the front page was Draco Malfoy, looking pale and gaunt, his eyes framed by deep shadows as his mother held his hand. Hermione felt a pang of sympathy for him. Yes, his father had attacked them at the Ministry, and he had been accompanied by Death Eaters that had done their very best to try and kill a handful of teenagers, but that didn't invalidate Malfoy's loss. It was still his father. But she kept that opinion to herself, and hid her pursed lips behind her mashed potatoes when Ron sneered that Malfoy deserved it. Harry was frowning at Ron, a thoughtful look on his face. But then Ginny asked him how his summer had been, a small blush on her round cheeks, and Harry seemed to forget who Malfoy was altogether in his hurry to answer her. His cheeks were almost as pink as Ginny's, and Hermione could feel a small smile tug at her lips. Apparently, there was something blossoming between those two, and she would be lying if she said that they weren't decently matched. Good. Harry needed to live like a teenager for once. Diagon Alley barely resembled the once so cheerful and bright street that had been her first touch with the wizarding world. Hermione chewed her bottom lip as she walked down the deserted cobblestone road, past the empty shops and broken windows. She could still remember how she had barely been able to sleep the night before her parents had taken her to buy her school supplies. They had been as much in awe by this beautiful, exciting, impossible world as she had been, childlike wonder lighting up their eyes as they walked behind her, and a sigh of longing when she had picked up her wand at Ollivander's. Not that there was an Ollivander's any more. The store was empty. The door burst open, and black scorch marks were all that remained of the place where every young witch or wizard got their first wand. Only a few shops remained open. Flourish and Blots were still serving customers. Gringotts was running as usual, and even the magical menagerie was still selling pets. Amongst them was also Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions. The bell above the door chimed as they entered her small shop, and a cheerful voice called out from the back, asking them to wait just a moment. While Ron settled in one of the plush armchairs and Harry twirled the ring he had inherited from Sirius around his finger, Hermione looked at the beautiful robes on display. They were beautiful, with the rich, dark fabric, the silver stitching, but the cut clearly favored the more curved mannequin, enhancing her chest and hips, and Hermione consciously crossed her arms over her chest. She had come after her mother's side of the family and shared the small, delicate statue that came with the lack of cleavage and narrow hips. And while she knew that she shouldn't be insecure about something she couldn't help, she still felt inadequate. Turning briskly away from the mannequins with one last, lingering look at the velvet material, Hermione suddenly met a pair of blue eyes, and her breath stuttered. Across the room, Madame Malkin had come out of the fitting room, followed by Draco Malfoy, as well as his mother Narcissa. The wraith-like witch was wearing robes that made the ones she had admired seem like cheap rags, gliding towards the register like a swan, with more grace in her elegantly clasped hands than Hermione probably had in her entire body. She sent a haughty glance towards Ron and Harry, her cool eyes lingering on Hermione for a moment, before she turned to Madame Malkin. Her son, meanwhile, kept his mouth firmly shut, his lips pressed into a thin line as he did his very best to pretend that he was entirely oblivious to Hermione and her two best friends. And yet, as he was trailing out of the shop behind his mother, she noticed that his eyes flickered to her before the door fell shut behind him. "Fucking Malfoys! Did you see how his mother acted? You'd think that with her husband in Azkaban she'd drop that attitude," Ron scoffed, earning himself a sharp look from Madame Malkin, who was ushering them into her fitting room. Hermione didn't comment on it, simply holding still as the witch was taking her measurements, blushing hotly when Madame Malkin muttered that she hadn't changed much since last year, and that some witches simply weren't blessed with enticing assets. Part of her, that strong-minded feminist part, that thought that holding witches to beauty standards and shaming them for their bodies was ridiculous and offensive, wanted to say something. But the other part, that blasted teenage girl part that was battling insecurities and all too aware of her unruly hair and flat chest, won. So she merely waited until Madame Malkin was done, before she buried her head in her book as Ron and Harry got their measurements taken. They paid for their new uniforms, shrinking the parcels, waved goodbye to Madame Malkin, and stepped out of the shop, almost running into a small group of fifth-years, who seemed to be on their way to get new uniforms as well. "Are we going to Fred and George's shop now? They told me something about new invention, and I want to check it out." Ron grinned, and even Harry looked excited, but Hermione quickly shook her head. "You two go ahead. I want to stop by Flourish and Blots, and I'll join you after," she said, hiding her impatience when both boys frowned disapprovingly. "I don't know. You shouldn't be by yourself. I could join you." Harry edged to her exasperation. Hermione understood that he still had trouble acknowledging and processing Sirius's death, and that he was still concerned about the after-effects of Dolohof's curse. But his mother Henning needed to end, lest she lost her mind. All Hermione wanted was a few minutes for herself, and without having Ron or Harry breathe down her neck while she was searching for interesting books. It simply wasn't something she had the patience for. "I'll be fine. It's almost right across from Fred and George's shop anyway," she promised, voice firm. There was a battle behind Harry's eyes, and it was only after Ron softly nudged his side that he relented. "Fine," Harry grudgingly admitted. "But if you're not back in 10 minutes, we'll get you," he said strictly, and Hermione conceded. Small victories. Kissing him on the cheek, she disappeared into Flourish and Blots, greeting the familiar shopkeeper before she dived into the high shelves of books. The shop was almost entirely empty, just a pair of students picking up some textbooks. Books weren't a priority in a world where the economy was tense, and where a lunatic with a god complex and equally insane followers was intent on wreaking havoc. Not that Hermione was complaining about having an entire bookstore to herself. Brushing her fingers over the countless spines, she wandered down the rows, stopping every now and then to glance at promising titles or peer into a tempting book. It only took minutes until there was a small stack of books floating behind her, each of them making her fingers itch with the need to read them and discover the knowledge printed between the leather covers. Hermione pulled out another book, her eyes lighting up with interest at the title and contents. It revolved around thestrals and equally rare magical creatures. And while she hadn't taken care for magical creatures classes since that disaster with Hagrid and the Hippogriff, she had never lost her interest in the topic itself. She opened it, leafing through the introduction, and began to read the first chapter, immediately getting lost in the theories of their origin and evolutionary aspects. They were truly fascinating creatures, and although she couldn't see thestrals, she had listened to Harry's description of them attentively and found one book in the Hogwarts library that included a drawing of them. Hermione was so absorbed in the book that she only noticed that she wasn't alone when something brushed against her arm. Fumbling with her book, she quickly looked up and found Malfoy staring down at her. He quickly lowered the hand that had brushed against her arm, taking a step back. Clutching the book against her chest, Hermione fought the blush that was healing her cheeks. To no avail, because all of a sudden her heart was fluttering in her chest, and there was a fluttering sensation somewhere in her stomach. "Malfoy," she said quietly as her eyes flickered over him, taking in how he had changed over the summer. He truly looked gaunt, like he wasn't eating properly, and the fact that he seemed to have grown another inch or two didn't help. His skin was sickly pale, as if he hadn't been outside in months, and a stark contrast to the black suit he wore. The fingers of his left hand were clenched around the end of his sleeve, as if he worried it might be pulled up accidentally. He wore a new ring, with a black stone carrying the family crest. The fluttering sensation in her stomach turned into worry, as Hermione noted the haunted look in his eyes. What had happened to him? His jaw clenched as he stared down at her, and Hermione calmly held his gaze, keeping her expression calm and unguarded. Suddenly, jerkingly, Malfoy raised his right hand and seemed to reach for a curl that had escaped her loose bun, only to quickly flinch back away when they heard high voices coming from the next row. "You shouldn't be out alone. It's not safe. There are people." Malfoy broke off, his voice rough. Hermione felt a shiver race down her spine, tightening her hold on the book. "I'm not afraid," she said, jutting her chin out slightly. The Slytherin scowled at the ground, muttering something under his breath that suspiciously sounded like Gryffindor, before he looked at her again. "They are just waiting for an opportunity to get their hands on you, Granger. You, specifically." Dolohof's face flashed in her mind as if having read her thoughts. Malfoy nodded ever so slightly. There it was again, that primal female fear. The instinctive knowledge, just what Dolohof had planned to do with her. "I survived being cornered by Death Eaters in the DOM. I think I'll survive crossing a street. Half of them are rightfully in Azkaban anyways," Hermione hissed, more defensive than she had intended, because otherwise she would have to acknowledge a danger she wanted to remain ignorant of just a little while longer. Carpe diem and all that. But upon seeing Malfoy visibly flinch, her anger dissipated immediately. Before she could even attempt to apologize, he had already turned on his heels and marched away. Closing her eyes tightly and taking a deep breath, Hermione decided she would figure a way to apologize to Malfoy later, but quickly dismissed the notion because that would be acknowledging how much their dynamic had shifted. And also because she was self-aware enough to acknowledge that she had a tendency to be petty, and sometimes couldn't find it in herself to forgive people. Rita Skeeter and Marietta Inchcombe could attest to that. Apologizing didn't exactly come naturally to her, and considering that Malfoy was even more unapologetic, their whole relationship was bound to be a disaster. No, not a relationship. He just stole some kisses. Nothing more, she told herself as she added the book about thestrals to the levitating pile, bustling to the register. The books were placed in another bag and shrunken down as well, added to the shrunken school robes. Saying her goodbyes to the shopkeeper, she stepped back into the almost deserted Diagon Alley. Hermione hurried across the cobblestone street, towards the brightly colored building containing Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Maybe it was just her imagination, But as she reached the cheerful red door, she thought she saw a head of fair, blonde hair duck into an alley nearby. How Fred and George managed to chase away the heavy atmosphere of a Dark Lord returning and spread cheer and joy instead, Hermione didn't know, but she wasn't surprised. After following Fred and George through a tour of their shop and awing at their pygmy puffs, or looking suitably impressed when they explained their newest invention of mischief and mayhem to her, she was left to explore while they haggled with Ron over family discounts. She joined Ginny, who was inspecting a vial of what Hermione belatedly realized was a love potion. Frowning, she picked up one of the heart-shaped glasses herself to inspect it closer. The potion had a vivid lilac color and seemed rather thick. It swirled slowly, a hint of a sheen on it. In her mind, she went through the love potions using pearl dust. There were a few, but most tended to be pink or white, rather than lilac. It reduced the possibilities down to 3, and her mouth thinned disapprovingly when she realized that all of them were quite strong and definitely concerning. She would need to have a word with Fred and George, because every love potion neglected the topic of consent. And to freely sell one so strong to teenagers, or anyone for that matter, was simply neglectful at best and malevolent at worst. The term roofies was all too present in Muggle media, and she wasn't willing to tolerate the wizarding equivalent. It would be another thing on her list of things she needed to campaign for once she had graduated Hogwarts and gotten a job at the Ministry. Putting the vial back, Hermione craned her head slightly to see if she could spot the twins somewhere, only to catch the eyes of someone vaguely familiar. Tall, conventionally attractive, and smirking in a way that screamed privileged upbringing and hereditary arrogance, Cormac McLaggen was staring directly at her. Hermione's mind briefly rattled down everything she knew about him. He was a year above them, he was really into Quidditch, and his family was known for being big in the Ministry. His ego was just as inflated as Malfoy's, though, although he had less reason to be. Ministry positions or not, the McLaggen fortune wasn't even a fraction of that of the truly influential families. But he certainly acted like a Malfoy, and Hermione had heard him drop the phrase, "Wait until my father hears about this," once or twice. McLaggen's eyes held hers for a second before he glanced at the stand of love potions, and then back at her, a slow smirk spreading across his face. Then he winked at her. Winked! Horrified, Hermione could feel herself blushing with embarrassment, which only seemed to spurn McLaggen on because his smirk widened. No, no, no. Decisively, she abandoned the love potions and ducked behind a display advertising fireworks. She breathed a sigh of relief when she found Harry and Ron at the register, where Ron complained about his brothers doubling the prices for him while begrudgingly paying for something that was called a screaming yo-yo. She merely hoped he would be exclusively using it in the boys' dormitories. They left before Hermione could give in to the urge of acquiring a pygmy puff, walking past Lavender Brown, who breathed a flustered, "Hello," to Ron's direction. Hermione furrowed her brows slightly in surprise. It wasn't like she was friends with Lavender, but they shared a dorm, and the other Gryffindor frequently talked about whoever currently captured her interest. She had never voiced any interest in Ron before, but Hermione had to concede that Malfoy wasn't the only one who had changed over the summer. Ron was good-looking, and he had grown a bit broader and more muscled over the past months. There was also an air of tentative confidence surrounding him, which suited him well. He definitely would pique the attention of quite a few witches once they returned to Hogwarts. Hermione was pulled out of her musings about Ron's newfound popularity and how it was only fair that he would no longer be overlooked in favor of Harry, when her other best friend suddenly hissed something about Malfoy and needing to hurry. And suddenly she found herself huddled underneath Harry's invisibility cloak, following a lonely Draco Malfoy down Nocturne Alley and into a shop called Borgin and Burke's, where he exchanged a few words with the shopkeeper before being led into the back. Dread settled in her stomach, but she quickly pushed it away. According to Harry, Lucius Malfoy had previously done business at this place, getting rid of some rather unsavory items, when the Ministry increased their raids for dark artifacts. And now that his father was in Azkaban, maybe Malfoy was doing the same, trying to clean the family name by severing all association with dark magic. She knew that it was wishful thinking, but Hermione wasn't willing to accept the only alternative, that Malfoy had come with the intent of purchasing dark artifacts. Although the sudden appearance of Fenrir Greyback made the latter a far more likely possibility. Hermione checked her trunk thrice, was hugged by Molly Weasley 4 times, and only managed to avoid a 5th embrace when Arthur fondly told his wife that she had yet to say goodbye to Harry. Promptly, the other honorary Weasley was pulled into her arms, and Hermione sniffled a laugh when she heard Ron mutter something about only being her biological son, and not even having received a simple goodbye, which earned him a scolding look from Molly. There was a small smile on Harry's face as he was smothered with motherly affection, and Hermione's heart swelled 3 sizes because thank Merlin for Molly Weasley and her seemingly endless capability to love. It was enough to chase away the grief still clouding his eyes, and although his smile dimmed slightly when they spotted Dean and Ginny making out in one of the compartments, once they boarded the Hogwarts Express, he looked happy and content. Hermione was hit with a wave of nostalgia as they left King's Cross, because this was already her 6th year, and it was the second to last time she would leave for Hogwarts. By next year, she would already be in her final year. Then her time at school was over. But the wave of nostalgia quickly ebbed away when Harry put up a surprisingly adequate silencing charm to share his suspicions that Draco Malfoy had become a Death Eater, that he had taken the Dark Mark, and was now one of Voldemort's loyal soldiers. Impossible. It would make him the youngest Death Eater in history, the youngest wizard to take the mark, however willing he had been. Just a few years ago, Hermione might have even believed and shared Harry's suspicions, but that was when Malfoy had still thrown around slurs and voiced his prejudice regarding blood status loudly. Denying Harry's arguments fiercely, she chewed her bottom lip guiltily when Harry left their compartment, muttering something about getting proof. Her guilt over arguing with him and vehemently denying his, at times worryingly logical points, turned into worry when he didn't return. He wasn't at the station in Hogsmeade, or at the carriages, and only arrived at the Great Hall after the feast had already finished, dried blood on his nose and chin. She ignored the fact that Malfoy had arrived late as well. The new school year began with a change in staff. As expected, they had a new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, but Hermione hadn't expected Dumbledore to appoint Snape to that role. For one, because the position was cursed, but also because, although he was ruthless and struck fear to younger students, and Neville still, Snape was a brilliant potions master. He was replaced by Horace Slughorn, who collected famous students like trophies, and quickly latched on to both her and Harry. Harry, who had gotten into the Newt level class after all, and could now, along with Ron, continue on his path to becoming Aurors. Hermione felt relieved and happy for the both of them. Until they were supposed to brew the draught of the living death, and Harry had seemingly turned into a potions prodigy over the summer. And as much as Hermione liked to believe that students reflected a teacher's ability to teach, it was impossible to explain Harry's sudden talent through Slughorn's passive teaching methods. It was also impossible that Harry not only managed to be better than her, but also better than Malfoy, who, to Hermione's chagrin, constantly bested her in potions. But this time Malfoy was only in 2nd place, despite having worked quietly and confidently on his own cauldron. Hermione was both irritated and silently fuming. On top of that, her hair was ridiculously frizzy and refused to be tamed for the rest of the day. It was enough to chase away her thoughts that lingered, scent of the amortentia she had identified at the beginning of class, and the pleasant cacophony of parchment, excessive silk, wool, and something tart like apples. Ron and Harry left her space to fume about her imperfect potion. She might be willing to concede that Malfoy knew his way around a cauldron, but she refused to believe that Harry had suddenly developed an interest in the subject, never mind the ability to be better than her, leaving her to stew with her perfectionism for 2 days before admitting to detailed notes in Harry's textbook. And while the world was suddenly right again, Hermione still ignored them for a week because she couldn't condone cheating. Especially not when it affected her grades, as petty as it was. But when they hesitantly asked her if she would be at the Quidditch tryouts, she agreed. Of course she did. Since Oliver Wood had graduated, Harry had taken over the team. He had grown as a leader, having gotten a lot of practice as the head of the DA. But even from the high stands, she could see that he was nervous as he tried to address the chattering group of Quidditch players before him. It took a sharp, "Shut it!" from Ginny for the rowdy Gryffindors to shut up, and Hermione smiled into her scarf when she noticed the awe written across Harry's face. It was beyond adorable, and she privately thought that they were well suited for each other. Her gaze flickered to Ron, who looked nervous and pale as he paid rapt attention to Harry's speech. She gave him a small wave and got a shaky smile in return. only to suddenly make eye contact with Cormac McLaggen, who had joined Ron and was sending her another wink. He said something to Ron, which seemed to make him even paler, before glancing at her again. Whatever they were talking about, Hermione had a slight suspicion it was nothing good. When the tryouts began, she realized why Ron was so unsettled. McLaggen was intent on becoming keeper this year, and although she had never paid enough attention to Quidditch, she knew enough from her time dating Victor that McLaggen had the better chances. McLaggen, who flew past the stands, smirked at her before taking his place in front of the goals. Across the pitch, Ron was wobbling on his broom, and Hermione sighed silently. So much for a school year where she wouldn't break the rules. But manipulating a broom seemed harmless compared to setting a professor's cloak on fire, aiding Harry in stealing the Philosopher's Stone, smuggling out a dragon, abusing a time-turner, punching a student, permanently disfiguring another, blackmailing a reporter, founding a secret organization, or luring another professor into the Forbidden Forest to let her be abducted by centaurs. She hid her smirk behind her scarf when McLaggen scowled irritatedly at his misbehaving broom, before fondly clapping when Ron rediscovered his confidence and proved that he definitely deserved the position as keeper. It didn't stop her heart from dropping every time Ginny performed a reckless maneuver, or Harry dove towards the hard, unforgiving ground, only to pull his broom up at the last second. At the end of the tryouts, she swore to herself to never attend another match because clearly she didn't have the nerves for it, and it was a far too dangerous sport in the first place. Magical healing abilities or not, anything could happen. Ron had secured himself the position as keeper, and he continued to gloat all the way through dinner, not even stopping when Ginny fondly hit him over the head once they were sitting in the common room. It was late enough that most students had already retired, but all three of her friends were still wide awake from the lingering adrenaline and euphoria, so Hermione decided that she might as well cancel her early morning study session in the library and spend some quality time with them. It wasn't like she was particularly eager to go to bed anyways, because sleep evaded her. She often spent at least an hour tossing and turning, trying to shove away all the thoughts about Malfoy, who didn't even look at her anymore. He seemed completely oblivious to her presence, and it hurt more than she liked to admit. Maybe she should apologize to him after all. "Oi, by the way," Ron began, pulling Hermione out of her thoughts. Lowering her copy of the Daily Prophet, she glanced up at him expectantly. "Cormac asked about you. Cormac McLaggen?" He explained as if there were any other McLaggens running about. Luckily not. "He seemed interested in you." "He's revolting," she spat immediately, folding the newspaper before she could crumple it. "I'm no more interested in him than I am in a frog." "Dad told me some muggles sometimes kiss frogs because they turn into princes," Ron noted calmly, and Hermione made a mental note to tell Arthur Weasley that the average muggle did not act out fairy tales and stop believing in magic or beasts by the time they reached puberty, despite the popularity of Disney movies or fairy tales. Ron was saved from a lecture about accurate muggle behavior, something he should know because he was taking muggle studies, by Harry, who was once again leafing through his textbook, seemingly in awe of whoever had once owned it, an unknown student going by the name of Half-Blood Prince. Voldemort and his fondness for anagrams and titles made Hermione wary of people who called themselves Lord or Prince, a sentiment that wasn't shared by her best friend, who was incredibly trusting of the book, despite the incident with Tom Riddle's diary in second year. But he continued to use it, impressing Slughorn to the point where the professor was falling all over himself to praise Harry's talent. At times, Hermione wondered how Snape would have reacted to Harry's sudden potion stardom, had he still been their professor. He was reluctant enough to give anything better than an exceed expectations, so he would have undoubtedly found something to subtract points for, or at least check Harry's potions book. But instead, he was teaching defense, as always favoring his house, and Hermione silently mused whether or not his favoritism towards Slytherin went as far as awarding house points. She was, however, aware that he still brewed for the infirmary, but only because she was required to let Madame Pomfrey check up on her and her curse every Sunday, and because he was the one who provided the potions that she still had to take every day. According to both Pomfrey and Snape, she would only have to take them until the end of the term, and then they would start to taper her off of them in hopes that she wouldn't start showing symptoms again. Between exam preparations, seeing Harry pine for Ginny, and catching herself thinking about how to approach Malfoy to apologize to him, the school year passed quickly. The weather in Scotland was as unwelcoming as always, and it had begun to snow in November, much to her dismay. Hermione had never been fond of cold weather, but even she could be coaxed to brave the snow at the next Hogsmeade weekend, the promise of a nice butterbeer and a stop at the bookshop enough to lure her out of her favorite corner in the library. They came across Slughorn, who invited her and Harry into his famous Slug Club, which Hermione accepted eagerly. She was all too aware that Slughorn had the habit of throwing parties and the connections to put big names on the guest lists. From what she had heard, he knew almost the entire ministry, and it would be the perfect place to forge connections. Her elation lasted until they were on their way back to Hogwarts, only to stumble across a cursed Katie Bell. And Hermione realized that this was once again the point where another school year would turn into a disaster that undoubtedly ended with Harry risking his life, being the stupidly selfish, lovable idiot that he was. Despite Katie Bell being cursed, things stayed surprisingly calm. Harry voiced his suspicions of Malfoy, but was quickly reprimanded for it by both McGonagall and Snape, and things went back to normal. Hermione attended Slughorn's dinner, where Malfoy was noticeably absent. He should have been there, and she briefly thought that he might join them later because of an empty chair, but then Ginny appeared and mumbled a quiet excuse about being late. If she hadn't lost her appetite during the first course, where McLaggen had tried to make constant eye contact while nibbling on a breadstick, the realization of why Slughorn hadn't invited Malfoy would have been enough. Slughorn collected students and forged connections. He was almost like a spider, sitting contentedly in a net woven out of favorable relations and a carefully maintained image. He had been Tom Riddle's professor, and still avoided being excluded from society after Voldemort had started the First Wizarding War. Of course, he wouldn't invite Malfoy, because regardless of the fact that he had excelled in class and was a model student, his father was a convicted Death Eater. Another testament of ignorance and the unwillingness to look beyond status, heritage, or names. Just as Malfoy would always be the son of a convicted Death Eater, Hermione would always be the witch who was brilliant despite being Muggle-born, and who had such peculiar parents. It made her just as sick to the stomach as Cormac McLaggen licking ice cream off his finger while giving her what could only be described as bedroom eyes. When Slughorn mentioned a Christmas party, she made a mental note to ask Ron to accompany her before McLaggen could ask her to be his date, because she knew that guys like him didn't accept a mere no and would only back off if another wizard had laid claim on a witch. It was archaic and sexist. Besides, she had intended to ask Ron anyways, because she was aware that it bothered him not to have been invited into the Slug Club in the first place. Despite the fact that he had never shown much interest in academics, to be the only one in their friend group not to be acknowledged by a professor still stung, especially when Harry had never shown much interest either. Even if his success in class had motivated Harry enough to invest time into the study schedule Hermione had put together for him. Enough for him to join her every second day while she was revising in the library, and after a few tense first weeks during which she had to berate him for breathing too loud or tapping his foot, they had begun to study well together, and she had grown to tolerate his presence. It was also the only reason she wasn't alone when she suddenly felt her heart sting painfully. Hermione gasped quietly, rubbing a hand over her sternum to chase away the pain. "Everything all right?" Harry asked, looking up from his book, and Hermione flashed him a reassuring smile. "Just some lingering symptoms. Nothing serious," she assured him, because she was. Dolohov's curse had been nasty, and she experienced bouts of dizziness or pain. But they had lessened over the past few months, and Snape's potions helped her heal quickly. However, Harry didn't seem convinced. "You look awfully pale, Hermione," he said worriedly. "I'm fine." She didn't feel fine. Not at all. The pain didn't go away like it usually did. Her fingers started trembling, and suddenly there were spots dancing in front of her eyes. "Just a bit dizzy. I should have eaten more at breakfast," Hermione laughed. Then she promptly fainted.